I'm not that into watches, and while I think Rolexes are beautiful, I just don't have the heart or inclination to drop that much money for a timepiece. Having said this, there are a few watches out there that really mean something to me, like this watch my wife gave me or my first ever mechanical watch from Seiko. But maybe the watch that has the most significance for me is this one. Victorinox is not really a brand that is known for its watches, but it is a brand whose Swiss Army knives have great sentimental value to me. I am the youngest of 6 boys, and my father had this tradition that every time each of us would turn 13, we would get a Victorinox Swiss Army knife. It was a symbol for us, like a coming of age. So when I saw this watch, it ticked all the boxes for me. It's a mechanical watch with a design that reminds me of the utilitarian nature of a Swiss Army knife. In fact, I love this design so much, I just had to have them in all 3 colors. I'm 39 years old now. I am a father myself and have 3 boys of my own. I look forward to the day when each of them turns 13 and I can give them their own Swiss Army knife. This video isn't supposed to be about my love for these watches, but I did feel it important to share the story behind the build because it's the significance of these watches that inspired me to build something unique. Sure, I could have just built a simple watch box, but it didn't feel right. I wanted to build something special. This piece of wood, I don't even know what species it is, but it must be over 60 years old. It's lumber that came from my lolo's old apartment building. I know it doesn't look like much now, but just stick around and trust me when I say it'll look so much better by the time we're done with it. So after cutting it, I had to start milling it, and I trimmed off one edge and took out the other using that freshly trimmed off edge as a reference for the table saw fence. Then I cut that first piece the width of the insert where the watch is, and then I proceeded to trim it to the thickness that I needed it to be. So you see here I'm trying to cut that oval shape with a jigsaw. This actually didn't turn out that great. It was uneven. Plus, when I had to trim that other side, this cut here didn't feel safe, so I immediately stopped and I decided to try a different technique. So instead, I trimmed the width of the piece into the width that I needed the insert to be. And then I set up a stop block and I just cut rectangles out of the piece of wood. And then what I'll do in the next clip is I'll trim out the corners, which is what I'm doing here now. So after I cut those corners, it was just a matter of rounding them out on my disc sander. Here's a neat trick. That skateboard eraser works great to clean up that disc sander. I proceeded to the next part of the build, which was to construct the edges of the watch holders. And just like the previous part, I trimmed them off to the right thickness that I needed. Then set up a stop block and then proceeded to cut consistent sizes for the edges. Here's a neat trick. I saw this on YouTube. Mix some baking soda with some sawdust, put in some super glue, and it dries almost instantly. The only thing that didn't work here is my super glue wasn't runny enough, so I don't think it was mixing into the sawdust well enough. But yeah, anyway, it worked just fine. You sand it off and it's nice and hard and serves its purpose. So after that, I needed a way to cut half circles on those watch edges. So I went on Facebook and asked for some help. So what I did was I cut up some scraps to sandwich in between the 2 edges. And then I used a hole saw to cut those half circles. This technique was actually suggested to me by some people who commented on my Facebook page. So after that, I took a router and I just trimmed off the middle part, and then the next step was to round off the edges so that, well, number one, so that it's sort of a nicer finish, but also so that it doesn't damage the straps of my watches when I'm trying to put the watches in and out of the watch holder. So I know this is probably not the safest way to do it. I could use a router table. I don't have one yet. Maybe I'll build one as a next project. So after I had that, I just started gluing them together. So that oval block piece, I glued it to one edge, I let it dry. And once it was dry, I glued the other side on. So then the next step was to route some keyholes into the pieces. I know you can buy keyhole hardware for this. I just thought this would look classier, so I did that. And I think it turned out pretty well. So now that I have the watch holders, it was time to build the plank on which all of these holders would hang on to. So I took that last piece of wood and I started to mill it. I'm not really good with an electric planer, but this Makita one worked really well. I actually really like this unit, and it gave me a pretty flat and consistent edge. So once I had a flat, consistent edge, I could reference that off of the table saw fence, and I proceeded to thin out this piece into the thickness that I needed it to be. So that first run was really just to get rid of that rough edge, and then I took out my feather boards so I could safely cut the workpiece to its final width. After that, I just trimmed it to its final length, and then I proceeded to round the edges. Once the edges were rounded, I then put on some tape to protect the workpiece, and then put in the screws from which the watch holder would hang from. I really just put on the tape to try and protect it so I wouldn't have to sand it again in case I would mar it or accidentally hit it. So once I took out the tape, I finished it with some wood wax. I purposely decided on wood wax because I felt that it would bring out the grain of the wood the best. Also, this piece is not really going to be exposed to the elements. It's going to stay indoors, so it's not going to need major protection for the most part. And I actually like the way it turned out. The wax really brought out the character of the wood. So once I was done, it was time for a dry fit and then install the hardware that we're going to use to hang it on the wall. So if you notice, there's a piece of cardboard there in between the workpiece and the hardware, and the reason I did that is so that when I attach the hardware on the workpiece itself, I can use the cardboard to reference the holes that I drilled on it on the concrete wall where I was going to hang it. And after I drill those 8 holes to hang the hardware, it's just 8 screws, and then check that it's level, and then it was time to do the final install. And that's it. This build really meant a lot to me. So I want to thank all of you for watching this build, and I'll see you on the next one.